beginning particularly with the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, we in U.S. history can begin parsing our recitations, our stories, our periodization based when we're talking about the domestic issues in the United States, based on the periodization of the presidencies, that is, the terms of particular presidents. We have come to have what many people have called an imperial presidency. That is, the president of the 19th century and the late 18th century was perceived as a weak office. There were strong presidents that we remember, but the presidency itself was only as strong administratively and politically as the holder of the office cared to make it. Now, after the Second World War, with globalization and with American military and economic might being so predominant in the world, and with the Cold War and its aftermath, and now with our so-called global war on terror, we find that the office of the presidency is significantly more important in American life in general. This is a consequence of a number of different factors that are more appropriately talked about by political scientists and political historians. But suffice it to say that it is impossible to break away from talking about the presidents when you talk about domestic policy in the United States, particularly political and economic occurrences. So the next two lectures, this and the one following, will talk very much about the impact of three presidents. As we've talked before, about these three presidents are Richard Nixon, and we're talking about economic policy here because that was so dominant in the period of the late 1960s, early 1970s into 1980. Gerald Ford is the second of the three, and Jimmy Carter is the third. We'll talk about Ronald Reagan, and Reagan will be the last president we speak much about. But all of these presidents are, particularly Nixon, Ford, and Carter, and to some great extent Reagan, have had to govern as prosperity has ended in the United States. Now, this is not to say that the United States is not the wealthiest country in the world. It certainly is. It's not to say that the United States doesn't have a huge amount of money, a huge amount of influence. It does. And that's not to say there's not a lot of money in the American economy. There certainly is, and the standard of living is certainly extraordinary. But the rise of prosperity has leveled off and begun to fall. And this sucks money out of the system, sometimes deliberately, sometimes just as a consequence of money going elsewhere. Throughout the world, I mean physically elsewhere in the world. Nevertheless, the real impact is on people's perception. And whereas in the aftermath of World War II into the end of the Johnson administration, we find ourselves thinking that prosperity, the kind of rapid growth that we experienced in the 1950s is normal, and indeed it is not. That's an aberration. And the lifestyles that go along with that are potentially an aberration as well. So it takes a while, however, for the political machinery to give up on that hope that the economy will continue to expand at the rate that it had before. Now, whether that will occur or not is yet to be seen, but we know that during the 1970s in particular and into the 1980s, our economy faltered and prosperity began to fall apart. So how did prosperity end? Well, beginning in about 1968, we see that the U.S. economy goes into a period of inflation based on trying to have guns and butter, which was just too much for the U.S. economy. And by guns and butter, I mean that we spent a tremendous fortune on the Vietnam War, prosecuting the Vietnam War and prosecuting other forms of both nuclear deterrence and military presence throughout the world, at the same time that we had burgeoning government aid programs going off in many different directions, that is the Great Society programs, and a very expensive space race. Trying to put a man on the moon and do other things in space, in part as part of the Cold War, and showing that the commies that we were more better than they were. But what really yanked the rug out from under American prosperity was the oil embargo of 1973 and the subsequent oil crisis in the mid-70s and again in 1979. The oil embargo of 1973 occurred because the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, a cartel of Middle Eastern nations that exported oil, cut production and shipments to the United States in reaction to the U.S. support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This was an Arab versus Israel and its allies embargo designed to punish the United States in particular for supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This, the net effect of this was that it made gasoline expensive and just simply hard to get. For example, I began college in 1973, and in order to get back home, where my high school girlfriend was still, I had to pay the guy driving the car. We always carpool. Had to give him cash money, but also had to bring a gallon of gasoline because gasoline was just simply hard to get in 1973 and then into 1974. This inflation and the results of the oil embargo led to a situation called ultimately stagflation. Stagnation plus inflation, stagnation of business activity and inflation of the currency. Now, a lot of this came about, a lot of stagflation came about because of structural weaknesses in the economy, such as the wage price spiral and the attempt to spend far too much money without borrowing money to do so. We were a net lender. And the way we dealt with this was to print more money, inflate the currency. And so we had inflation. And then with the oil embargo knocking the business for a little bit of a loop, plus structural weaknesses in the economy, we end up with stagflation. And at the same time, we had a political upheaval, the slow end of Watergate, the slow end of Vietnam, did not help the situation at all. The continual problems in the early 70s, the late 60s and early 70s, socially and culturally, protest marches tended to keep everybody on edge a little bit and damaged economic activity when other things were triggering problems with economic activity. But by the oil crisis of 1973, our most significant issue was Richard Nixon's Watergate problems. Well, by the mid-70s, after Nixon resigned, we'll talk about Nixon in just a second. After Nixon resigned, by the mid-70s, we're having some serious problems with the economy, and it's not a crash of the economy, but the economy just can't seem to get rolling. We have exactly the opposite problem of a depression. We have too much inflation, and prices are going up really, really quickly, and so people aren't spending money across the board. And so businesses that rely on that kind of consumer spending then are unable to foster any demand. So you have this bizarre situation. And this was a problem that plagued of the later Nixon administration and the Ford administration and the Carter administration into the 1980s. It even plagued the Reagan administration. We had a recurrence of the energy crisis in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War in 1980 took Iranian oil off the market. At the same time, President Carter had begun deregulating price controls on domestic oil, and it had a perverse effect of driving oil prices up, which took oil out of production, amazingly enough, because nobody could afford to buy the stuff. So this is how prosperity ended. Now, did we get prosperity back? There's still a lot of structural issues in the economy. Even during the dot-com boom, the structural issues of an underlying weak economy allowed that bubble to burst. Then we had a housing bubble and a financial bubble in the late 19-teens. And we've been living on Chinese credit and on American credit. Most of the American debt has been held by Americans. But these bubbles burst. You can have a bubble when there's an underlying weakness in the economy, and we've had that. We're not real sure what to do with ourselves since the end of manufacturing as the leading edge of the economy. Well, a lot of this is just simply natural, that when you have a major shift in the economy, you're going to have a lot of economic dislocation. Some of it is problems with people exploiting the economy, whether they're poor or rich. And some of it, again, is just, economic cyclicalism. So I suspect that we'll right our economy sometime in the near future. Goodness knows, I hope so. But even if we right it the wrong way, we could end up with yet another bubble like we saw in the 1990s and the 2000s. But all of this began as prosperity ended after 1968. Well, the president after 1968 was Richard Nixon, 1969 to 74. Now, we see with Richard Nixon a move to the right in American domestic politics. Not just the body politics begins moving right, but but policy begins moving right, though goodness knows Nixon would be considered a leftist in the 20 teens. But that remains to be seen how he is treated by historians. One of the ways that Nixon moved the country to the right was to try to absorb the Wallace Democrats into the Republican Party. And as George Wallace Jr. said not very long ago, the Wallace Democrats of 1972 became the Reagan Democrats of 1980. Well, Nixon attempted with his so-called Southern strategy to exploit white resentment of the civil rights movement and fear of riots to move conservative white voters into the Republican Party. His economic policies tended to spark both inflation and then he had trouble with the oil economy of 1973, which was nothing that he there was nothing he could have done anything about. But to try to break through inflation and the oil crisis, he adopted Keynesian solutions for stagflation. And that was he froze prices and wages for 90 days to fight inflation. Can you imagine a Republican president issuing an edict from the White House, an executive order to freeze prices and wages for everyone in the United States for 90 days in order to try to break the wage price spiral? And he abrogated the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, which allowed the U.S. dollar to float against other currencies. He took the U.S. Dollar off of its pegging to gold and allowed it to float against other currencies. This weakened the U.S. dollar which was very good for exports. And politically, all of this was liberal rather than conservative. And Nixon again, a fascinating character. When he was a diehard anti-communist, but in today's debased political debate, his economic policies were decidedly on the liberal side, but they were considered very conservative at the time. His foreign policy was pretty remarkable as well. As we've talked about before, he ended the Vietnam War after Vietnamization, signing the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. He established détente, or a cooling of bad relations, hot relations with the Soviet Union. And he visited Red China, Communist China, establishing relations with that regime, the Mao regime, for the first time since 1949, even though he made his first political splash as a McCarthyite-like red baiter in California. Nevertheless, Nixon's government fell in the Watergate scandal, in which he covered up, which made him an accessory after the fact and guilty of obstruction of justice, a small-time break-in against the Democratic National standard bearer in the 1972 election, George McGovern. And of course, the cover-up's worse than the crime. This raised distrust and disgust with the federal government, and in August of 1974, he was just about to be impeached for obstruction of justice when he was convinced to resign from the presidency, the only president to resign from the presidency. So we see that prosperity ended, and with the end of prosperity, we have a concomitant move to the right. I don't think that one caused the other in either direction. It just happens that those two things occurred simultaneously. Now we'll look at Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter's presidencies. Thank you very much for your attention.